Recently, I watched a YouTube video by landscape photographer Thomas Heaton in which he argued that he dislikes street photography because he does not want to get close to people, have this awkward interaction, and having to explain why he took the photo of another person in the street. And I think being scared of other people's reactions on whether you should photograph them in the first place is a very, very relatable feeling many street photographers have, and some of them do not even get rid of. In my case, for instance, I absolutely hate getting close to people. I hate getting their photos and going like really close up. I also hate to afterwards having to explain and justify why I took people's photos. So I feel terribly awkward at getting close to people and do what is considered real street photography. But what Thomas Heaton and many other photographers miss is that street photography does not necessarily have to be this narrow idea of street photography being this close-up technique where you have to use a wide-angle lens and get close to people. And in today's video, I want to share with you a few techniques that you can use to take great street photos without getting close to people. And these strategies have actually helped me to embrace my fears and make my fears of getting close to people my own personal photography style. So I would say without further ado, let's get right into it. The first technique to get great photos without being close to people is to adopt the mindset of a landscape photographer. And a landscape photographer usually sees a scene, there is something they like about it, and they will try to make a composition around it and create an amazing photo. And this exact strategy you also need to adopt for discreet street photography. In other words, it's the composition that matters most. Try to find a nice scene and create a composition that works for it. And the human element is important in it, but not the most important thing. It's really about the scene, and the subject will actually just become your focal point. And having a smaller subject has a few advantages. First, it shows more of the surroundings the subject finds itself in. Second, you can also play with scale, as the inclusion of a smaller subject makes buildings appear even bigger in comparison. Additionally, and that's probably why you're here, you can be discreet because you look for scenes, not for subjects. And since you're composing for the scene, not chasing people, it doesn't look like you're photographing them specifically. Most of the time, people won't even realize that they are, in fact, the subject, which makes your shooting more natural and unobtrusive. Another way to think about this landscape photographer's view of prioritizing the composition is to think about it in terms of the hunter versus the fisher as a type of photographer. While the hunter will hunt for subjects, look for interesting subjects and hunt them around to take their photo, while the fisher will prioritize composition, like the landscape photographer, wait until the right subject passes through your scene and then snap the photo. And usually there is a trade-off going on between the hunter's and the fisherman's technique, because while the hunter will have an amazing subject, the fisher will have an amazing composition. But most of the time you will have either an amazing subject or an amazing composition, unless you have what Henri Cartier-Bresson would probably call the decisive moment where everything goes together. The conditions are right, the composition is right, and even your subject pops into the right place and is absolutely amazing to make everything work together as it should. Another strategy that spares you from having to mess with people is to shoot on tighter focal lengths. And tighter focal lengths have a few advantages. First of all, it's going to make it easier to simplify the scene because you simply have less in your frame that might potentially distract from your subject. Additionally, it allows you to be further away from your subject, but at the same time still have a tight field of view, like on a 50mm or even on an 85mm. And the final reason why you should consider longer focal lengths is because it allows you to compress the scene, or in other words, bring your subject and your background closer together. It will just give you slightly tighter compositions. If we go back to this Ferris wheel composition, the Ferris wheel was actually super far away. But since I was shooting at a 135mm full frame equivalent lens, the Ferris wheel appears relatively close compared to your subject. And that's definitely an advantage that you can use if you use a tighter focal length. But that said, a wide-angle lens is equally as powerful as a tighter field of view because, first of all, your subject doesn't have to be really big in the frame, so you don't have to be that close up. And secondly, it gives you more potential to include a foreground, a midground, and a background, and also more flexibility to include leading lines into your frame. The next way to do street photography without having to deal with people is to shoot in a way that you silhouette your subject. Because the standard conventional definition of going close up and taking photos of your subject usually implies that your subject is visible and recognizable in your scene. And this is probably what you want to avoid if you want to be inconspicuous and if you do not want to drag attention on you. But if you silhouette a person, so you make sure that a bright light source is behind the person, then you can make sure that the person stays anonymous because the entire identity of the person will be obscured. And the reason why it makes me feel more comfortable as an afraid street photographer is because I literally have the photo as a proof that the person is silhouetted, therefore anonymous, and even if they ask me, yo, why have you taken my photo? I don't want you to take my photo. Then you can say, oh, don't worry about it. You are not actually recognizable because your face is obscured because you're silhouetted. And I personally live in a country where privacy laws are relatively strong, meaning that taking photos of people in the street while they are recognizable is a bit of a legal gray zone. But by silhouetting people, people are not recognizable and therefore I will never ever get in legal trouble with my photography. So now the question is, how do we actually create a silhouette? And what you need is a bright light source and a subject to walk in front of it. The most common light source, for instance, is a setting or a rising sun. And when you then expose for the highlights, or in other words, you underexpose your photo, your subject will become a silhouette. The sun is, however, just one example. Here, for instance, the contrast between the shadow under the tree and the brightness in the background are enough to create a silhouette. Or alternatively, you can also use car lights or shop lights at night to create amazing silhouettes. And some people criticize silhouettes, arguing that it's not a very good way to tell a story because the emotion is missing. And this is true to the extent that you do not see a person's face, meaning that you don't see whether they smile, whether they cry, and that's true. But at the same time, you can tell a story through a silhouette. Because if you, for instance, have a look at this couple here, you can see that there is strong emotions evolved in this photo. These are expressed through the colors. The colors are relatively warm in the scene, but also just through the way the couple is standing and how these two people relate to each other. So in other words, a silhouette does not have to be boring. It can also express a feeling. Because if a person, for instance, is interesting, carrying an umbrella, riding a bike, or a couple holding hands, that's still going to be visible in your silhouette, and that's a really nice way to tell a story. And then finally, I also want to give you a few subjects that you can photograph in any conditions, because I know from long time experience, like 2 years, lol, but I know for sure that they won't care when you take a photo. And the first one is runners or bikers, because they are all on a mission. One wants to pursue their run and the other person has to get by bike from A to B. And they are not going to stop to beat you up because you've taken their photo. They will continue their mission and you're relatively safe to take a photo of them. Additionally, when it rains, people are usually all in a hurry. They all focus on themselves and they do not mind when you photograph them because they simply do not care. They just care about getting into the dry as fast as possible. And by the way, I'm planning an entire video on how to shoot in the rain, so make sure to subscribe to the channel so that you do not miss this video. And then a final aspect that I wanted to add is that you do not necessarily need to have a human in your frames. A simple architectural scene is nice too. Additionally, consider photographing animals you find in the street. And although it is often implied that you need a human element for the photo to be a street photo, but honestly, don't restrict yourself too much by these narrow definitions of what street photography is and what it is not. Just go out and photograph whatever you would like to photograph without giving everything you do and shoot a label. Is there any other pieces of advice that you would give to a scared street photographer? Drop them in the comment section below because they can be incredibly useful for the beautiful photography community we have. And if you want to know how you can be the most discreet possible in the street and what this camera has to do with it, then I invite you to check out this video up here in which I tell you all about that. And with that being said, thank you so much for sticking till the end, and I hopefully see you in next week's video. Bye.